And with that, we will begin. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Anna Puzskin-Chevlin, who is the Regional Director of Growing Climate Solutions Paths to a Positive Southwest Florida. She's a champion for sustainable policies with extensive experience in helping communities become climate resilient. As the regional director, she oversees climate education and outreach efforts to accomplish the partnership's primary goals, which are to empower community members and leaders to initiate change, ensure a prosperous and healthy community, and build climate literacy and resiliency. Puzskin-Chevlin previously was sustainability officer for the city of Delray Beach, where she was responsible for developing and implementing the city's sustainability policies, programs, and project initiatives. These included climate resiliency, adaptation and education, transition to renewable energy, water and energy conservation, advancement of green building principles, community recycling efforts, green municipal government, sea turtle and tree canopy protection, and green and equitable economic development. She has worked in corporate real estate sector and academia as a senior research fellow with Florida Atlantic University's Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions, special project officer and assistant director of graduate programs of urban planning at Columbia University, and chief operating officer for Health Sciences Consulting Group. She has a doctorate and master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree in sociology from Oberlin College. So with that, I now shall introduce our speaker.
Am I on now, Larry?
You're on now.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to share a screen. We'll get started. Give me 1 second.
We did rehearse this before the program started, so
it's
there we go. Fabulous.
There you go. All right, everyone. So it really is my honor to get to speak to you today. I do a lot of climate education in this region, and I relish the opportunity to engage others in things that are really important to me. So I appreciate your attention and the fact that you took time out this morning to engage in climate. So as we get started, it's really a monumental point. We're out about 1 year ago now that COVID started to come to the United States and to Southwest Florida. And a lot of us have experienced a tremendous amount of pain, both economically and personally. We've lost loved ones. And we know that COVID has really changed our lifestyle. In fact, I think you can all acknowledge that many of us that are still working are now working from home. About 33% of the workforce now works from home all the time, and 25% work from home intermittently. We've also found that during this year of COVID, how many of us have done a home renovation project? Well, according to Business Wire, about 57% of Americans did some kind of home improvement project this year. And if you remember at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when we found ourselves at home a lot, and we didn't know why there wasn't any toilet paper or whether there would be cucumbers or peppers, how many of us started growing vegetables and herbs in their garden or in pots? Scott's Miracle Grow saw a 36% increase in the number of people that are gardening. So the reason I bring that up is that while all of these small things didn't seem significant to us, after a year, the changes that we did in our lifestyle resulted in a 10% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And if we could sustain that trend, but bring back some of those jobs and ease the economic pain, we would have the best of both worlds. We would be within striking distance of meeting our obligations to the Paris Climate Agreement, and we would be able to rebound with a green economy. So today's presentation is going to be sort of 4 parts. First, we'll talk a bit about rising greenhouse gas emissions, because that's the driver of climate change. Then we'll look at the kinds of impacts we can anticipate here in Southwest Florida. And there are a lot of them, both natural and built environment. I'm going to focus on sea level rise, hurricanes, changes in precipitation, and heat. Those are the most significant that we talk about. We'll then change over to what we can do about it. What are the common sense ways to reduce these emissions? And finally, we'll open it up to questions. So as I begin today's presentation, let me rewind everybody back to a time where they were in earth science in high school, because it's been a long time for many of us. And if you haven't had a primer, you may not understand why this greenhouse gas issue is so important. So this is a diagram by NOAA from the IPCC report, and it's very simple. The sun gives off infrared radiation that travels through space, and some of it comes to the Earth and it bounces off the atmosphere and back into outer space. But the majority of those infrared rays come through the atmosphere. Some hit the Earth and then get reflected off of a reflective surface, like ice and snow on the peaks of mountains or white surfaces. And they also leave the atmosphere, but the majority come through the Earth and get absorbed into different objects, the ground, buildings, pavement, water. And over, as they get absorbed, this wavelength slows down and it gets re-emitted as infrared heat. It's a longer wavelength. So, longer wavelengths are warmer. And some of it escapes the atmosphere, but the majority gets captured in our atmosphere, bounced around, and that's what keeps the Earth temperate and warm and allows life to be here. And how much of it actually leaves the atmosphere and how much of it gets bounced around depends on the composition of the gases in that atmosphere. The analogy we use is it's a blanket. You can have a perfect blanket, like a down cozy blanket, but if you put a lot more blankets on top, it gets hotter. And that's exactly the issue that we're having right now. As we've modernized through the industrial era, as we moved from horse and buggy transportation to cars that burn on fossil fuel, as we've moved our factories from hydropower that used to be mostly on rivers to electrical power, as we've changed the type of agricultural practices to mass agriculture, we've emitted a lot of different gases that change the composition of that atmosphere and retain more heat. The one we talk about the most is carbon dioxide because it's the largest and it has a very long lifespan in the atmosphere. But equally important are methane, which is emitted from organic sources. It's 28 times more potent than CO2, but it also gets dissipated faster, and nitrous oxide. And we know that this is an anthropogenic, which is a human-induced issue, because we've been tracking and can track the levels of CO2 in our atmosphere for hundreds and thousands of years. And in this graph on the left, you see that from the 1700s, as industrialization sort of began worldwide, we've seen a very slow uptick in the CO2. And then around 1950, where mass industrialization took off in the United States and most of the developed world, the levels of CO2 climbed precipitously. We went from 315 parts a million to 404 parts per million. And now, if you look at the graph on the right, this one is from 2019, we're at 411 parts per million. Now, climate deniers and skeptics have said, what greenhouse gases have always fluctuated and carbon dioxide has always fluctuated. What's different? Why is this a climate emergency or a climate crisis? And there are a lot of explanations, but one I can show you right here is that this shows the changes in CO2, and we see that it's jagged, but it has never gone above 300 parts per million. And this is in thousands of years ago. 400,000 years ago. So yes, we've gone up and down and the climate has changed, but never since humans have walked the earth in the past 20,000 years have we ever exceeded 300 parts per million. And we are now at 411 parts per million. So the same way we've anticipated the climatic changes in the past, that's what we can anticipate coming in the decades to come or in the centuries to come if we don't get this under control. So with that, we really have to look at what are the impacts we have to plan for. And I'm going to focus on sea level rise, coastal storms, precipitation, and heat waves. So where is that warming going? Well, 90% of the heat goes into the oceans because most of the surface of the earth is covered in water. And when the oceans get warm, they expand. It's called thermal expansion. It's pretty simple. Remember in ninth grade, we had that Bunsen burner under the beaker. You warm up the water, the volume expands. The same thing happens with the oceans. So literally the volume of water is creeping up in part because it's getting warmer. But the bigger part now is the polar ice cap melt. So we had a lot of water locked up in the polar caps and in snow across different mountain ranges. And as temperatures get warmer, that ice melts. We've been losing about 10% of the polar cap ice each decade. And not only does that add water to the system, water melts and goes into the ocean, it also creates a feedback loop. Because remember when I showed you the diagram, some of those rays have to reflect off of a light surface to leave the atmosphere. So as we've lost the ice, and that what is exposed is green, permafrost and earth, and that captures and retains the heat. And the permafrost has a lot of CO2 locked in it, and that gets released. So we're literally creating a feedback loop, and this is accelerating. For example, and we can look at exactly a year ago in February, down in Antarctica, there was a 9-day heat wave. In fact, it was 64 degrees in Antarctica, the same temperature it was in LA. And in those 9 days, a particular island lost almost 35% of all its ice in one day. And it can't recoup it that quickly. So imagine that and multiply that across all of Antarctica and the poles. And we're really seeing a lot of glacier melt. So what does that mean? It means that sea levels are rising. And this isn't something happening in the future. It's already happened. Since 1950, sea levels in the Southwest Florida and Southeast Florida region have risen 8 inches. And that rate isn't a linear equation. It's a exponential equation. It's accelerating. So over the past decade, we've seen 1 inch of sea level rise every 3 years. So if you take a baseline of 2000, by 2030, in about 9 years from now, we will experience 9 to 15 inches of sea level rise over the year 2000. And by 2040, which is 20 years out, almost 2 feet, between 1 and 2 feet of sea level rise. And that's causing nuisance flooding, like you see in the picture to the left. That's Goodlands. It's a perfectly sunny day, but on a high tide, the roads get flooded and people's homes get flooded. What will that look like? So here's Collier County using a tool called the Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. And you can literally plug your address into this tool. It's really easy to use and see where your house will be. So I pieced together the coastline, and you can see that in the next 9 years, parts of the 10,000 island area in Collier will get flooded. And so will areas of the intercoastal and ravine areas. And this gets more significant by 2050. And that also means that property values will start to decline. In fact, in Florida, we have 100 zip codes that have 40% of the property value at risk from sea level rise. Naples, Sanibel, and Fort Myers Beach are particularly vulnerable. Zillow with Go Banking did a study in 2018, and they found that these 3 cities ranked 10th, 26th, and 32nd among all metropolitan areas in the US in terms of the property values at risk. And what's important to point out is that even before these homes have water on their front lawn all the time, during high tides, during particularly high tides during certain times of the year, perhaps 26 times a year, those properties will experience intermittent flooding, even in the absence of a storm or rain. And if you think this isn't catching up with our property values, it's starting to. So just about 3 months ago, the Wharton School of Business published a study. They looked at property values in zip codes that are vulnerable to climate change and found that the number of sales relative to sales in zip codes that are not exposed started falling in about 2013. And as sales lagged, eventually prices came around. So about 2 years ago, prices in those coastal zip codes started to decline relative to zip codes that are not exposed to flooding. The other issue, and this is, as all Floridians we know, are hurricanes. In a warmer world, we're going to have stronger and wetter storms. In fact, for every 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warmer air temperatures, we get about 7% more moisture in the air. So those storms become wetter, like Maria and Harvey. And as ocean temperatures get warmer, those storms become more powerful. So for every 1 degree Celsius in warming, the likelihood that we have a category 4 or 5 storm increases 25%. And for every 1 degree Celsius that the waters get warmer, the strength of those hurricanes will increase one whole category on the Safford-Simpson scale. So the chances are that we may not necessarily get more storms, but the chances of a category 1 and 2 storm will decrease. You know, us Floridians, that's just rain. But 4 and 5 storms make us evacuate, and the chances of those storms becoming more prevalent is rising. Combine that with what I told you about storm surge. Stronger storms and higher sea levels will mean that the storm surge will be higher and penetrate further inland, causing more damage. Take a retrospective look. Over the last 16 years, this part of Florida has experienced 9 strong storms over category 3 or higher, resulting in $203 billion worth of damage. This is Naples after Irma. Think of what we could do if we didn't have to rebuild ourselves from that storm with all of that money. The other issue are these extreme rains and extreme dry periods. So we call it variable precipitation, wetter wets and drier dries. And so when it rains, we'll get flooding. And when it's dry, we will get brush fires. Why does it flood? Well, I always like to explain this because people can't quite get their hands around it. Some of it's happening under your feet. What you can't see, you don't necessarily relate to. But Florida is largely built on a limestone base. Limestone looks like this sponge. Once it rains and these crevices fill with water, there's nowhere for that water to go. It puddles on the surface. It's also very swampy, and we wouldn't have been able to build anything in Florida had the Army Corps of Engineers not built those canals almost 100 years ago. But that canal system is kind of old technology. It relies on gravity to move the water from the freshwater system where it rains and it pours into the canals out to the ocean. There's a coastal construction feature that separates the salt water from the fresh water. And the way it works now is it rains, all that water comes into the freshwater side. The control feature is down. When the appropriate time comes, the water management district lifts that structure, the fresh water pours out, and we drain the canals. Well, with sea level rise, we will find a time where the ocean side will be level or higher than the freshwater side, let's say on a high tide. Now, if it rains, this water will accumulate and we cannot lift this structure because the water will flow the wrong direction. So what we can experience is flooding along the canal system. Even before that, we have issues of where the stormwater system drains out to. So you have these outfalls, they go into the canals and they rely on the canal water being lower than the outfall. During a high tide or during a strong rain, when water piles up in this canal, it covers the outfall. Then the water just backs up into the pipe and comes out on the other end, like in a parking lot or on a road. So this poor guy parked his car, rain came and he finds himself drowned out. The other thing I want to mention is the heat. And this for us in Southwest Florida is really important. I think that Miami-Dade and the East Coast have more of the flooding problems. Not that we don't have them, but here in Southwest Florida, we have one of the highest dangers of having heat waves in all of the United States. And what I mean by a heat wave are days where the heat index, not the temperature, the index, which includes humidity, is over 105 degrees. If you look to the right, this study done by scientists commissioned by Climate Central found that Fort Myers, Naples, and Punta Gorda ranked 5th, 6th, and 8th in the United States of the cities that will experience an increased number of danger heat days. So let's say in 2000, we would have about 26 to 30 days like that a year. By 2030, it's going to be about a third of the year. And by 2050, even more than that. And this has economic impacts because if it's 105 degrees almost a third of the year, who is going to be down here in July and August? We've built a really robust economy on an increasing number of year-round residents. But if it's that hot, maybe our summer residents are going to start going north, or our
Schwab.com.
winter residents are going to
Schwab.com.
our winter residents are going to not come down that early, or they may leave earlier. So one impact is danger heat days and the economy, but more importantly, health. Hot days are just unhealthy. It increases dehydration, heat strokes, cardiovascular disease. Heat also results in poor air quality, smog, for example. You get a lot more ground level ozone on hot days, and that impacts people with asthma and respiratory diseases. Hot weather and those rains make the trees produce more pollen earlier in the season. So you get more allergies, and that impacts people disproportionately. It's an issue of climate justice because the heat impacts elderly and children, outdoor workers, the people that are putting that roof on your house, fixing your roads, taking the weeds out of your garden. These are not the affluent workers working indoors on computers. These are hard manual laborers. And it increases impacts on low household incomes who can't afford air conditioning, for example. One really poignant study came out this year. JAMA looked at pregnancy outcomes. In fact, they looked at 32 million of them over 12 years, and they found a correlation between heat, ozone, and particulate matter and low birth weights. Where were the hardest hit areas? Communities of color, communities that are located near highways where air quality is poor. So now let's turn to the solutions. We're about halfway through. And I always think of solutions as an opportunity for better outcomes. And from the people who look at climate issues all the time, we break down these solutions into two types: mitigation, which is stopping those greenhouse gas drivers, and adaptation. What do we do to our environment to be more resilient? Today, we're going to focus primarily on the mitigation piece. If you like my presentation, I can come back and talk to you more about adaptation approaches. But we're going to look at what we can do to slow the pollution that causes climate change. And we believe that, we did a survey and found that about 80%, 78% of people in this region believe that they can personally do something about that. And 76% believe they need to take action. So you're among those people. If you're here today listening, I hope that when you get some good ideas here, you'll implement them. So where do we start? There are so many drivers. I look at transportation and electricity, and that's because they've done an inventory of where those gases are coming from. And in the state of Florida, 45% of the greenhouse gases emitted in our state come from the transportation sector. And another 43% come from electricity. The electricity we use to air condition our homes, run our computers, our TVs, and our lights. That number is higher in Florida than in the United States because in the northern part of the country, they heat their homes with natural gas and oil. We air condition our homes with electricity. I'm also going to look a little bit at the agricultural sector, our food systems, because there's a lot we can do there, and we really control what we buy in our grocery store and what we eat. So transportation is an energy choice. Every time you pick a mode, every time you go somewhere, you're making a choice. The average American produces about 50,000 pounds of CO2 equivalents each year. 20% of that is from driving. So one thing you can do as your car ages out is purchase electric or hybrid. It's really important. That used to be a luxury, but now almost every brand of car is coming out with an electric or a hybrid. The other thing you can do even before that is conserve fuel. Those are the little things, like making sure your tires have the right pressure, or taking those golf clubs out of the trunk. You don't need to drive around that extra weight. You want to improve the fuel efficiency of your vehicle. But most importantly, you can walk and bike. It's also very healthy. Nobody's going to argue with that. In fact, one interesting statistic is that these are new electric bikes who've become very popular. Over the past 2 years, the electric bike market has increased sales 23%. And the leading manufacturers in that sector are anticipating a 32% growth of electric bicycles in the next 10 years. That's a stock that I would like to investigate. Electric bikes just take the work out of it. It doesn't help your health, but it gets you where you want to go faster. The other piece of that is that we have to invest in public transportation. Right now in Florida, we do a pretty lousy job with our bus system. It's very inefficient. It doesn't run often enough to make it viable. Who wants to wait 45 minutes at a bus stop for a bus that may or may not show up? And you don't even have a covering over that bus shelter. You're standing in that rain and in that heat. So we need to invest in public transport. We want to make it electric, not fuel, not fossil fuel, so clean energy. We also need to accommodate those bikes and bike share and encourage walkability. And we've built a built environment that isn't conducive to that. I will point out that we do not build complete streets yet, but we are trying to. And what I mean by a complete street is we build big boulevards to move cars and trucks fast, but we don't take into account a walkable built environment. In this cross section, you see a more urban environment with a complete street. The sidewalks are wide for pedestrians. You have a sheltered bike lane that's marked. It's sheltered from the moving traffic by a row of parked cars and by shading of trees. Notice that the intersection bulbs out on both sides. This shortens the distance of the crosswalk, allowing the elderly or the disabled to get across the street with one traffic light cycle without having to stop in the median. This kind of built environment has to be seriously looked at if we're going to reform the amount of energy that we use for transportation and make a more viable built environment for users. I'll bring it real to you. Do you want to walk like these ladies on a street that looks like this, with light poles, no trees and lollipop signs, curb cuts with cars coming in and out, nothing to look at because the buildings are back here? Or do you stroll in a village on a street that has brick paving, the traffic is separated by the cars, and you can actually look into the windows? So as we move from an environment designed for cars, where this parking lot takes in a lot of heat because it's dark and the sun beats on it, to a more dense built environment, mixed use spaces, this will really help make our built environment more efficient and livelier, because you can actually walk from an apartment or a flat to a store, to a business, and you can enjoy the parking is now structured, it takes up less space. So we need to think about the built environment. Let's try to bring it to something you can really understand. Many of us in Southwest Florida, me included, live in a private single-family home, something like this. In our built environment of single-family homes, we drive about 12 to 15,000 miles a year in our cars. People who choose to live in a condo that's mid-rise like this, on average, drive 8,000 miles a year. That's half the amount of vehicle miles traveled. So we need to start building slightly denser. And boy, do we have plenty of opportunity. Here's an aerial of a typical shopping center, a sea of parking with spaces in between. Think about the opportunity to infill all of these spaces with condos and apartments that are both affordable and create a really lively built environment. So as a planner, I look heavily at these issues. But even before that, as you're sitting comfortably at home, there are things you can do, you as individual homeowners. First of all, many of us have already changed to LED lighting, but have you adjusted your air conditioning setting? 1 or 2 degrees makes a difference. Calling and maintaining those air filters makes a difference. It makes your air conditioner more efficient. You use less electricity, you save money. Ceiling fans. Most homes here have them, but people don't turn them on. They're like some kind of decoration. But ceiling fans can make a room feel 3 to 4 degrees cooler and use 30% less energy. So Turn off that air conditioning on a day like today. And if you need it, turn on that ceiling fan. Also, as we do those home improvements that we spoke about at the beginning of this presentation, most of us are doing granite countertops or fixing our kitchen. How about putting some of that money into proper insulation? Did you climb up into your attic and see if you have pink fiberglass? Can you improve the kind of windows you have? Even the sealants between the windows and your doors. And I like to talk about shading and cool roofs. Shading isn't just a decoration for your backyard. It prevents the solar heat from warming your environment. So homes should be built with integrated shade, not as an add-on or something that you're going to do, but as you build and remodel your home, add proper shading to your windows. We can also plant trees. Trees provide shade. They lower the surface temperatures by about 10 degrees. Trees take carbon dioxide out of the air. They improve the water quality and the air quality of our neighborhoods. Trees also improve property values and mental health. And if you look at some of the new developments that are built on what was once agricultural land, they have no trees. Builders put in a couple of palm trees because they think that's what Northerners associate to their new Florida home. But we have to really put in leafy trees. We have to put trees into our lawns where we may have lost some due to a hurricane or a storm. So on Arbor Day, take it to heart, perhaps plant a tree or participate in a tree planting project. Solar is another issue. Many of us with private homes, we think that solar is just too expensive, or that's something that greedy people do. That's not something I would do. I don't like the way it looks. But solar is the new trend, and costs have dropped dramatically, about 67% over the past decade. You can now make your money back on your solar array in about 6 to 7 years. So I encourage you, when you see an advertisement for a solar co-op or a solar contractor contacts you, learn about it, investigate it. If you don't want to put solar on your roof, or you can't, you're in a condo building, you don't own your roof. Now FPL offers the Solar Together program, and that's a shared offsite solar. That's a solar farm somewhere else in the state, and you're essentially buying a subscription to electrical juice being developed there for your home. But we also have to look at the policy level. The way we incentivize solar, the way we've made the price cost competitive is through tax abatement. And that's not a fair way to do it, because about 42% of the rooftops that could take solar, they're in low and moderate income homes. If you're a homeowner and you're not making a lot of money, you can't really offset your taxes with an abatement because you're not paying enough federal tax to make the abatement worth it. Or if you're living in a home that's constructed by Habitat for Humanity, for example, they're a nonprofit. They can't take advantage easily of those tax abatements. So the way we incentivize solar at a policy level, both state and federal, has to be re-examined. What's your role in that? Well, as those issues come up for policy, legislators, make your voice heard. Advocate that we need to be the sunshine state in Florida. I also want to touch on food systems, because about 9% of the greenhouse gases come from agriculture in this country. Some of it in the way we farm, but about 4% comes from livestock. So we always hear, eat less beef, eat more plants, and waste less food. And I like to touch upon the beef issue because I'm the daughter of Argentinians. We eat beef, and it's hard for me to even figure out how to cook vegetarian, right? So getting a handle on my beef consumption is a personal challenge. But when I started to read up on it, I realized why it's so important. And that's why I'm sharing this with you. Cattle are the #1 source of greenhouse emissions in the agricultural sector worldwide. We hear a lot about the impact of cows. Yes, they produce about 220 pounds of methane annually through belching and farting and such. And so methane is a strong and potent greenhouse gas. So we have to try to reduce the number of cattle head. But more importantly, the feed conversion rate of cattle is very high. It takes 25 pounds of corn, feed, and grass to produce 1 pound of beef. Compare that to chicken that only requires 4.5 pounds of feed for a pound of chicken. And beef need a lot of water. So when you combine the feed ratio and the water and their need for grazing, that prompts in other countries deforestation to allow the beef or the cows to graze in more land. They tear down more of the Amazon and more trees, and it's just inefficient. By comparison, if we were to change over to, let's say, a plant slant diet, and I'm not saying vegan, but if we were to switch the ratio and eat more plants, we could reduce in the United States the greenhouse gases from that agricultural sector by 70%. And even if you don't care about the emissions, it's good for your health. It supports our local economy. Florida produces a lot of, fruits and vegetables for the country. You can even grow it at home and it's less expensive. So you'll save money and improve your health. Together, we also have to look at the waste. We are fortunate to live in a country with abundance, and many of us are comfortably off, and we buy a lot of food and things rot in our fridge, or we overcook. About a third of the food that we make and doesn't make it from the farm to your fork. In fact, in the US, we waste about 33 million tons of food a year. That's about $2,000 per family. So reducing the amount of waste reduces the amount of emissions. It reduces the amount of emissions in the landfill from that methane as organics decompose into methane, and it will save you money in your wallet. And if you do have some kind of waste, and everybody does, how about learning to compost? Composting is something that people previously just did in their backyards. But since we've invented a very efficient waste management system, our waste just goes away. A truck comes and picks it up. So we don't care what we throw into the garbage, but we really could reduce the amount of material in our landfill by 30% if we would make a concerted effort to compost. This is my composter at home. I'm not very good at it yet, but I'm learning. It's like a hobby. It's not too hard, and you can get lots of tips online, but I encourage everyone to experiment with a composter. Not only will you do the right thing, you will develop soil that is rich in nutrients for those plants and for your gardens and for your flowers. You won't have to buy Miracle-Gro. And as we have those strong rains, that compost retains more water. And because it's so rich in complex carbons that break down, it promotes a higher yield. Those tomatoes will never taste better. Finally, as we approach the end of this, I want to talk to you about the power of your purse. Every day you shop, and what you buy makes a difference. It's a signal to our market economy of what's important. So when when you wipe up on a spill on your counter, if it's, grape juice, you may pick paper towels. But do you really need to wipe up water with a paper towel? Or can you use an old-fashioned dish rag and reduce the amount of paper towels you use? When you're going on a picnic, can you pay a couple of extra dollars and buy the cooler that is compostable versus styrofoam that is just a nightmare to our waste management system? And when you buy gifts for people, do you have to buy the latest knickknack? Do you need a toilet paper holder that plays music for you? Or maybe buy gifts that are experiences, concert tickets, lessons for swimming or lessons for yoga. Help those 1099 employee workers, that gig economy, make it on their feet. Don't buy stuff, buy experiences for your giftees. In fact, stuff is a big issue. And I love this slide because it really drives the point home. We buy a lot of stuff, and stuff is an energy choice. We buy so much stuff, then we store it. We have so much stuff that we store, things handed down, things you don't want to throw out, that we've created an industry, a building typology called mini storage that actually air conditions and stores all our extra stuff. There are about 60,000 storage facilities in the United States, representing 1.7 billion square feet of space. And most of it's air conditioned. So we have more mini storage in the US for stuff that we think we need and becomes obsolete than the footprint of all the Starbucks, McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, Pizza Huts, and Wendy's in the entire country. So think about that the next time there's something you think you want, it's a kind of gag thing, but you know it's going to end up in your closet and be kind of useless. Finally, put your money in the right place. There are a lot of companies now that do socially responsible investing, and this used to be a fringe part of the market, but now those funds actually outperform some of our traditional funds. Look that, ExxonMobil was taken off the Dow this year. So talk to your investment advisor. Set a part of your portfolio to be invested in ESG funds. Those are funds whose companies actually look at their environmental footprint and their social governance. So the next steps, I'm going to summarize that every time you're out there, whether it's transportation, whether you're turning on a light, turning your thermostat, whether you're saving water, gardening, whether you get into your car or you take a bus or you take a plane, every time you go to the supermarket or out for dinner, you're shopping and you're investing, each of them is a choice. Think about the sustainable choice and try to make more of those. You won't be perfect, certainly, but if you're conscious about it, you'll do it more often. Now, I'll also make a shameless plug for Growing Climate Solutions. I hope you find what we say interesting and that you join us. Go to my website, which is growingclimatesolutions.org, sign up for the newsletter. You'll get kind of interesting tips and information about sustainability and climate issues. Maybe follow us on Facebook or Twitter if you tweet. Take a few moments today to post on your social media that you learned something. Post what you learned, because what you learn influences your family and friends. So one thing we've learned in the climate world is that this issue has been highly politicized and partisan. And to break that down, we need you. We need you as role models to talk to friends and neighbors. And don't be scared of this topic. Tell them, don't approach people as you're not doing the right thing. Share with them what you've learned and maybe 1 or 2 changes that you're doing. It's contagious. They will then be curious to learn more and maybe they'll also do it. You can also post things on your social media. If you read an interesting climate article in the Wall Street Journal or in a magazine, talk about it on your social media. Post it so that others read it too. And when issues come up in your community, communicate your concerns to elected officials. In my adaptation presentation, I talk a bit about the kind of decisions that elected officials will have to make in the coming years. And it's hard to raise taxes or to go out for a bond to do these projects. The only way elected officials will do climate-friendly policies is if they know that their stakeholders care. And it's awkward. I didn't used to write my city officials, but now I do. A short note, they count those emails and it makes a difference in the way they vote. So the takeaways from today are that climate is a societal issue, not just environmental. It impacts your health and our economy, our property values, all kinds of ways it interacts with our lives. 2, we must mitigate these greenhouse gases to slow down climate change, and we must also adapt to their impacts. We have to think that this is going to be worse in the long run, so we have to act in the present. There's no time to wait. So talk to people, engage those around you, maybe even take a leadership role. You play bridge, you play golf. Use these opportunities to get other people engaged in climate concerns. Because even though we don't know whether it's going to be 1 foot of sea level rise or 18 inches or 2 feet, there's no time to wait. It's just because we don't have all the details is not an excuse for inaction. We have to work now. And with that, I thank you so much for your time, and I'm here to answer questions and hopefully engage in a lively conversation.
Thank you very much. We will now, I have some questions here taken from the that I've got on text, so let me kind of run through them. The first one, which is something we can do offline, is you have a link for the Wharton School info on zip codes for determining risks. And you can just send me that later and I'll send it out to people who are interested. Second question from Dimitri, can you talk about some modern technologies that capture CO2 and/or methane from the air?
There are technologies. I know that the fossil fuel industry has been talking and tapping into some of these. A lot of them are at the source of electrical production, capturing some of the burned emissions and reusing them. There's heat and there's heat capture technology that also makes air conditioning more efficient, but there aren't large scale carbon capture programs and technologies out there yet. One of the technologies that's interesting and very controversial is what they call there's a group called silver lining, which is what they call climate engineering. They're looking at putting certain vapors and gases in the air to reflect more of the infrared radiation out of the atmosphere, or to cool, to create cloud cover that will cool certain areas like the Great Barrier Reef and reduce the heat impacts on corals. But many of these technologies are pretty new, and people think that they may get misused. If we cool the atmosphere, then there won't be an urgency for reducing the impacts. One of my newsletters has that. I wrote about that in a newsletter technology. I can also send you a link to the Silver Linings group talking about that. And the plug for the Wharton School of Business piece, Growing Climate Solutions is holding a 3-part climate lecture series called the Climate Compass. The first one is in February on the 24th. It will feature a former congressman from South Carolina, Bob Ingalls, whose speech is, or presentation is, the conservatives' approach to solving climate. And he talks about carbon tax. There's one in March, and the third one in the series, the April 21st speaker. I have that Wharton professor who led that study. He is my guest on a 1-hour presentation just about the research on those property values. So mark that date on your calendar, April 21st, and sign up for the Southwest Florida Climate Compass series. It's all free, it's all virtual and online. It's at 4 o'clock on that day.
Mark Gerber has a question.
Thank you. I've listened to any number of these seminars on climate change, including from people who don't believe in man-made climate change. And those are also quite convincing. I have the power of ignorance behind me, so I can be easily convinced. But there were some things that were said in this presentation that were kind of, to my mind, alarmist. For instance, the heat index of 105 is not the temperature. Naples has never seen a 100-degree day in its history. I found that amazing, but I believe it to be true. Whereas as a kid in New York, I remember 100-degree days, many, many years. Also, you show the hockey stick graph of ppm of carbon dioxide going from roughly 300 to 400. And yet the reality is that 300 ppm is 3% of 1% of air. And 400 ppm is 4% of 1%. When I engage people in these kinds of conversations, I ask them how much carbon dioxide is in the air. People don't know. And that's the fact that it is so minuscule makes this whole subject, to me, questionable. I don't know the answer. There was a 30-year projection made by the United Nations Committee from 1978 to 2018. How did that projection turn out? We all know that computer modeling has its limits, as we found out right here in the COVID experience. And from what I understand, those projections were wildly off target on the high side. So I guess I'm concerned that on both sides of this issue, you get wild things. I mean, I've seen cycles of sunspots over thousands of years. Solar activity, I should say, really, of which sunspots is part of it, that causes heat spikes that go back thousands of years. There's a lot of correlation that
Mark, is there a question here? We have a lot of other questions. So if you have a question,
well, the question is, what is it?
Okay, so I mean, you brought up a lot of issues here, and we try not to be alarmist, and that's why when I present the heat issue, I make sure that people know that we're not saying the temperature is going to be 105 in terms of heat. It's the heat index, which is the temperature and the humidity, and that's actually what impacts health. So, and we did have this summer a week where the heat index was 103 degrees for at least 6 days. So we do.
I don't dispute that.
To experience that. In terms of you're correct that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a small percentage of all the molecules in the atmosphere, but that small difference makes a big difference in outcomes. I mean, when you take I take blood pressure medication, I take a very small pill, yet it lowers my blood pressure several points. Proportional to my body weight, it's a small amount of medicine, but it's still quite effective at having an effect on the entire system. Likewise, carbon dioxide, you don't need a huge change to impact the temperature 2 or 3 degrees. And 2 to 3 degrees, when we measure it on a scale, seems very little, but there's a big difference between having your temperature be 98.6 and having 101. Those 3 degrees do a very big difference to the whole system of your body. Likewise, the changes in the composition of the atmosphere don't have to be a huge amount of the air composition to make a big difference on our climate. What we do find is that both sides of the issue of climate, there are climate deniers, they're very persuasive. There are climate alarmists that are also create a lot of fear. And both extremes tend to cherry pick statistics. At Growing Climate Solutions, we try to sort of walk the middle line. We don't use climate emergency. We don't tell you that this is the end of the world. We just say that we have a responsibility to try to bring things back in line. And we can do that pretty easily. The solutions we're asking for aren't going to turn the world upside down. They're just going to help do our part to bring those gases down. So, I mean, there are people that will choose to believe what they want, and both sides can be pretty alarmist. Like, for example, about a month ago in December, a climate denier posted an editorial in the Charlotte Sun. He was a mathematician, had that PhD credential behind him. I was like, wow, and he looked at the sea level rise and said in his editorial, I have looked at these numbers myself, and it has only been X amount over 100 years. At that rate, who cares if it's a couple of more inches? Well, he also manipulated the numbers. We don't look at sea level rise over 100 years. If you spread it out over 100 years, it's a small amount. But if you look at it over 50 years where 8 inches have occurred, that's a more significant amount. And if you look at that, and he did not recognize the acceleration curve, which we are seeing, and you can't argue with these numbers. The buoys are there. The data is there. We measured it over the past 30 years. We're following the data. So if he had put those numbers in terms of the data, that would show there is an increase. And by the way, what makes him the authority over climate scientists that study this for a living? He's a mathematician, not a climatologist. Likewise, I would say, be skeptical, read different points of view. But the truth, in my opinion, lies in the majority opinion. When you look at all the climate deniers, they represent about 4% of the scientists. 96% of the scientists all over the world don't agree with them. And it's not a huge conspiracy. They don't all get online and say, oh, let's move these numbers. In that game where you used to ask the audience, most of the time the audience knew the answer. So the consensus is usually right as opposed to the outliers. And the consensus are the people driving the models today. Those models are pretty accurate and becoming more and more accurate as we get more satellite data. The satellite data from the 70s was notoriously, you had to do a lot of interpretation, but the satellite data that we're getting now is better and better. And these models are not just invented, they're pretty solid.
Okay, so I have a few more questions from people I want to get to real quickly. Red tide, a climate problem or a different issue?
Both. It is both a different issue that's exacerbated by climate. So, the red tide issue goes back strongly to extra nutrient load that gets into the waters due to fertilizer and poop and all kinds of contaminants. They get warmed up, they feed the natural algal blooms that are there. Heat is like an incubator. The warmer it gets, it just makes things grow more. So you can't blame red tide on warmer waters, but it just makes the problem harder to fight.
Okay, how would you rate or how would you evaluate the potential effectiveness of the new administration's climate policies on achieving greenhouse goals, and what about carbon tax proposals?
Well, we're all very excited about the Biden administration. They've done more in the first 10 days to put us back on track than where we've been in the past 4 years. How it's going to shake out, we're still waiting to see which policies get implemented in which agencies, but they're working on it. We're all very excited. For me, the excitement also comes in the fact that they are willing to support local governments in addressing these issues. Before, there was abdication on the federal side and local governments just couldn't afford it. I mean, I come from the city of Delray Beach originally. They had done a stormwater study and found that one particularly affluent neighborhood on the intercoastal needed $357 million worth of stormwater work to prevent flooding. Where is a town of 67,000 people going to get $357 million to increase flooding in one small neighborhood? Should that money be spent there? There are kids in that city that go to bed hungry, right? So knowing that there's going to be some kind of federal and hopefully state support for some of the adaptation measures is heartening to me. Another approach is that we're going to hopefully look at policies to subsidize a greener economy. And, like I spoke about that solar incentive, we need to change the way we incentivize solar so that it's more equitable and more people can participate. We have to rein back some of these arcane policies that tilt the scale away from sustainable solutions. So FPL has a tremendous power in Florida. The fact that we don't have a good net metering system disengages people from getting solar. I can explain that if people are interested, but FPL will basically let you consume your own juice that you develop on your roof so you can run your house pretty much free. But if you overproduce, they won't purchase that solar at a market rate. So it doesn't incentivize people to maximize the amount of solar they can produce because they don't want that. Well, that reduces our potential. These kind of policy issues have to be looked at the state and federal level. And we need to start, taking the subsidy away from fossil fuel and giving those subsidies over to cleaner energies. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also in a wait and see. I want to see what actually happens.
Great, thank you. Another question about nuclear power. Good for the environment or not so good?
Well, I'm from an era where we remember 3 Mile Island, right? We know about Chernobyl. And the answer is that many environmentalists don't want to hear is that it's really part of our solution. In terms of a cleaner, carbon or fossil fuel energy, nuclear is part of the equation, no doubt. And other countries do it safely. Is it ideal? The uranium mining is difficult. What to do with the waste is difficult. We need to innovate and perhaps put technology solutions to work there to deal with the spent rods and make that safer. But I don't rule it out, but it's one of those pills that I don't like to swallow. But I admit that it has to be part of the equation.
Hey, someone asked a question about, someone says one volcanic eruption puts more carbon in the air than 2 years of all the cars in the world. So can we really make a difference?
Yes, we can, because we don't need the situation where we have a volcanic eruption and we have the 2 million cars. So we need to do what we can on the anthropogenic side, because we can't control what Mother Nature is going to do. And eventually some of that, it's not just the carbon dioxide, it's the soot, it's the dust. But some of that actually shades some of it. It's a two-part equation. So yes, it produces CO2. At the same time, it creates some particulate matter that creates cloud cover, and that cools environment. So the net equation, it's not good, but it's not as bad as just the CO2 part. But we certainly can do our part to reduce the greenhouse gases that we're responsible for. And that's why I started with the first slide, that in this year of economic slowdown, and that is unfortunate because it's impacted our economy and our businesses and labor and employment. So not that I'm saying that COVID is a good thing, right? But that slowdown, those fewer cars on the road, really helped bring down our emissions profile quite a bit in 1 year. And if we put our minds to it in all the different sectors, we could do a lot to help offset that. So these small actions, if everybody did them, would make a dent. That's the whole message.
Okay, I have one last question, which I'm going to try to describe. Well, I guess I'm going to distill it down to this. Isn't this really just a world population problem? If the population stabilized, would this problem also stabilize?
It is a world population problem. One of the things I don't talk about in my presentation is the international perspective. I'm going to be developing one of those presentations, but most people don't ask that. So we have a developing third world. As they become more affluent, they consume more stuff too. They want to eat more meat too. And so as we have population growth and also an increase in economic standards of living in the developing world, we contribute more to the greenhouse gas issue. But other countries are also working on the same thing. I mean, China is developing technologies for cleaner transportation than we are. And that's a shame, because they recognize their billion-person population, and they're working actively to lead on transportation technologies and greenhouse gas technologies. So it would be a shame that American innovation, which put us on the moon, would fall behind India and China in terms of greenhouse gas sequestration technology. We need to be a leader in this and export our technology elsewhere. So the opportunity is here to invest in these research components and these emerging technologies and these emerging businesses, so that as the population grows in other countries and they need solutions, they can turn to the US market and find those technology solutions that we've developed so that we can prosper. Not sit back and say, well, we are all comfortable, and then have those technologies be developed by other parts of the world. So it's a time here. I mean, one thing we look at is Israel and water conservation technology. There is no other country in the world that does more innovative stuff in terms of water conservation than Israel. And other parts of Africa, where do they turn when they need water conservation? They turn directly or indirectly to Israeli companies. Well, we in the United States need to be the leaders on clean technology, because everybody's going to need it. They should turn to our economy for that, not to others.
Well, on behalf of everyone on the program and the organizations we represent, thank you very much for your time today. It was a terrific presentation, and we really appreciate you spending both the energy and the time for making this possible. Folks on the program, as I said, this recording will be available on the MCA website for MCA members only on Thursday. And don't be surprised if we schedule another program later in the season or beginning of next year to sort of take another step in how we can all become better environmental citizens. So thank you all for being here. And with that, we'll end and stay on for a second after we're done. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Stay safe and healthy.